I am your host, Justin Yachts, and today my guest is Thomas Ackerman. He is a cinematographer for such films as Beetlejuice and Anchorman, to just name a few. And this is part one. Enjoy. Okay, today I have a special guest with me. I have Tom Ackerman. Am I pronouncing your name correctly, sir?
Exactly.
Good.
Ackerman.
All right.
Yep.
Wonderful. How are you doing, sir?
I'm doing very well, thanks. It's kind of chilly over here in Winston-Salem, but I grew up in Iowa, and what is called cold weather here or bad weather, it pales by comparison. It was really cold out there. A lot of
Yeah.
snow. Anyway, so much for the weather. It's all good.
So, so you mentioned growing up in Iowa. How did that influence you as a filmmaker?
Well, in one very important way, I grew up seeing a lot of movies. And it wasn't really in fashion for people to see a lot of movies, but it so happened that my dad was a projectionist at one of the big theaters in town. And he was also a stagehand, so he did like tech work behind the scenes at the Ice Capades and all the shows that came to town. But it was his role as a projectionist that was important to me, because I would go down to the Times Theater, and the projection booth was right next to the manager's office, so I was always welcome there. So through the open door, I could watch my dad operate the projectors. I could smell the machine oil. Smell there was the burning at that time. The light in the projector came from a carbon arc burning, and the whole ambience was one of it was very unique. And then I'd sit in the manager's extremely comfortable red leather chair, open these bay window shutters to the theater, and there, pretty much ensconced comfortably, I would see lots and lots of movies.
When you sat in the managers, were people more accepting of film back then? Like, would people come up to you at the manager's box and say, I didn't like that film? Or would they give opinions, or was it just kind of a treat to go to the movies?
I think there was very little criticism, very little critical thought being given by a typical audience member. And yeah, people had their likes and dislikes, but it was mainly focused on the movie stars and, commenting on the story to some extent. But fundamentally, it was they went to the movies for pleasure. That's what they expected. That's what they got.
Did your father, because you said your father was a stagehand, did you guys have theater in Iowa? Did he help with theater?
Well, we did have theater, but primarily he would do things like special venue shows that would come through town, the Ice Capades, for example, but also stage productions, and he would, for the Ice Capades, he would run a follow spot. He'd be following the action around a rather large rink. He had been, interestingly, or coincidentally, I don't know how interesting it is, but he had worked for Fox Newsreel company during the 30s and shooting newsreels, which were shown in the local theaters, actually, regional theaters, because they had lots of processing facilities all around the US, and they could actually get their film in, get it processed and printed in time to make, I don't know if they got it there the next day, but I think in many cases they really, put the move on and did. So he was very encouraging in the sense of sharing the movie experience with me. I don't think that he had any real hopes or expectations, I should say. You know, a dad always hopes for the best outcome. But I don't think he had any expectations, nor did I, that a kid from Cedar Rapids would one day be able to make movies. Quite a stretch to imagine that. And I think it's safe to say that he didn't. Not that he wouldn't have been extremely proud. He died when I was a young boy. And I thought many times that he would like what I'm doing now.
So you kind of had a link together at that time with the movies. The movies kind of linked you to your father in some ways. That's great.
Exactly.
Awesome. Now you talked about in previous interviews, Abbott and Costello meets the Wolfman. I wrote Frankenstein. I apologize for that. It's I believe it's in your interview you said meets the Wolfman, and you said that left an impact on you as a child, as you were like, everybody was enjoying it, but you were like scared. Could you talk a little bit about?
Sure. Now, let it be known that Abbott and Costello were a very popular comedy duo who made lots of movies. So people associated them with going to the theater to laugh. And in fact, there was a lot of jokey humor in Abbott and Costello Meet the Wolfman. However, what trumped that, what totally overshadowed that for me as a little kid, was the werewolf himself, because the makeup was just, it just scared the bejesus out of me. It was like really, really traumatic, actually. And so, yeah, that was an example, I guess, of being, I wouldn't call it deeply moved, but certainly emotionally impacted by what was happening up there on the screen.
Yeah, for me, it was Gremlins. That scared me, but I liked Gremlins anyway. So I'd be scared of it, but I still wanted to watch it.
Yeah.
Type of thing.
No, Gremlins was very freaky in its own way, for sure.
Did you kind of already answered this, but did your parents encourage film, or did they what was their feeling about you being so curious about films?
Frankly, it was nothing that we talked about at home ever, as far as I can think, as far as I can remember. As a kid, I wasn't terribly involved. I mean, we didn't have a home movie camera. We didn't have an 8mm rig, that I could be shooting with. It wasn't until maybe 6th grade that I helped a friend make a short movie in the school, the Arthur School play art. But I was at that time growing very fond of photography. My mom was very generous, indulgent maybe, and she made sure that I had the equipment that I needed, which at that time was very simple. I had my very first acquisition was a Kodak Pony 135 camera. I should have brought it here to show you because I've got one. It's not my yeah. But it's a very simple little 35mm camera, no rangefinder, not a very fast or elegant lens. But I was able to shoot pictures with it, which I did. I took colors, what we call them slides, color slides, transparencies that would be brought out and viewed on a projector on a screen at home. And I do remember very well getting a roll of film, one roll of Kodachrome with that Christmas package. And that 36 exposure roll lasted all of the Christmas holiday, New Year's. I might have even stretched it further. but the point is, it was expensive, the film. It was, the camera was very, there was no such thing as a motor drive. You would click, roll, and, forget about, bracketing pictures at 10 or 12 a second. It was a magical experience to see that first roll of film projected on the screen. In the 8th grade, I was given the wherewithal to put together a dark room in the basement of our house. Again, nothing very fancy, but it had an enlarger, safe light, the developing trays. And that got me into another level of photography, which was the carry through, the delivery of an image after you've photographed it and tweaking it as you go forward. And I should have brought this down. I've still got the twin lens reflex of the Minolta autocord camera, which took 120 roll film. I still have it. It's a great camera. And I haven't used it in years, but I could. So I was at that time pretty much immersed in still photography. It didn't occur to me for a long time that there would ever be a future in cinematography, making movies, simply because we were a very long distance from any production center. Chicago, sort of, definitely not Hollywood, and not New York. Those were at that time the hubs, and still are to a large extent, of motion picture production. But when I attended the University of Iowa as a freshman, and I continued through to graduation, I was able to take a couple of film classes. It was in the School of Speech and Dramatic Art, and the offering was frankly not. It was not USC. Let's put it that way. It wasn't. It wasn't UNCSA, where I now teach, but those courses were sufficient. They got me. They whetted my appetite, and but having said that, if somebody, when I graduated, if someone had come up with a job offer from the local TV station, Channel 2 in Cedar Rapids, boy, I would have been elated. I would have been happy to shoot news for the 6 p.m. broadcast. That would have been great with me. But a number of things intervened. Number one, the Vietnam War. Now, the handwriting was on the wall in 1964/65, and I figured a lot of my friends were being drafted, even the rich kids. The draft was just sucking up a lot of people.
Yeah, everybody.
Yeah, and I thought, I better get back into Air Force ROTC. So I scrambled to do that, knowing that at the end of that process, when I graduated, I would get a commission as an officer. And I figured, no matter what, even if I wind up sitting in a missile silo in North Dakota in the frozen tundra, that's better than carrying an M16. Well, in fact, I lucked out and was classified as a motion picture production officer in the Air Force. And I thought, yes, I was so happy with that assignment. And initially I went down to Orlando, Florida. We had like a major motion picture studio down there that made training films and documentaries and so forth. Shot all in 35 millimeter with Hollywood style equipment. It was a really cool job to have. Little did I know, although I quickly figured out, that would be definitely an assignment to Vietnam. And indeed, I was assigned about a year and a half after I arrived. I was assigned to make a training film for the Veterinary Corps, how to care for sentry dogs. I made a film for the chaplains, the Air Force chaplains, and I made a film for the Wild Weasels, which were an electronic countermeasure outfit. When they would fly into a target zone and jam enemy radar so they couldn't lock on the attacking aircraft. I was there for 2 months with that. And it was pretty interesting because it was right after the Tet Offensive, which was a really big surprise for the American forces because the North Vietnamese made this extremely successful assault on the South. Very, very aggressive. At Tan Son Nhut, the headquarters base in Saigon, they tunneled under the perimeter fence. And when I say tunnel, deep and like 50 meters inside the base, and then dug up, popped out, and the guy, all of a sudden, the next thing you know, the guys in the pith helmets are running around inside America's premier installation. So it became fairly obvious that that things would not necessarily go well in that theater of operations. I came back to Florida and was almost immediately reassigned back to Vietnam for a 10-month tour of duty. And at that time, I lucked out and was able to wrangle an assignment in Thailand with the 355th. So, and that was a challenge of a different kind. Here I'm at 20, maybe I was 24 at the time. I'm essentially a kid who was given command of a 70-person detachment, all guys at that point. And some of them were old enough to be my dad. Wow. They were the sergeants, a lot of the operations level people. And on the other, so that was one kind of communication issue. How do I get them to buy into me? I'm just a kid.
Yeah.
There were kids my age and younger who were the enlisted people. And these were the guys that would occasionally fly rear seat with the 355th, shooting with their Airflex 16 millimeter from the rear seat, various types of combat activity. We serviced the 70 millimeter bomb assessment cameras. We did a whole bunch of stuff like that. I occasionally flew a mission here and there for the kind of selfish purpose, I guess, of I'd take a few pictures, but I also would get my combat deduction for the month and my combat pay. And that got hairy a little bit occasionally. But anyway, long story short, a smattering of experience in the Air Force. But what really worked out well was that as I was about to get out of the Air Force, I wrangled an interview with Charles Guggenheim, who was by then in Washington. Multiple Academy Award winner, 7 nominations, 5 wins, and an Air Force friend had become his production manager. So now I was first in line to have an interview, and it went well. And Charles hired me. So I lived in Washington for 3 years, working with this amazing man and a master filmmaker. You don't win 5 Oscars. And they were all for his documentary work. But I not only shot for him eventually, but I cut film. I cut a half hour, probably the most extensive was a half hour film for the government of Israel that I edited for Charles. And he was a really tough boss, which I tell my students is what you want. You don't want to be kind of indulged. You want to be driven. And I tried my best. And
with Charles, though, it's interesting because, he combined a lot of, a documentary feel to it, but there's this cinematic look to his documentaries that make them very eye-catching at that period of time when probably a lot of the documentaries were just shoot. Whereas he'd be doing different angles.
Yeah, they were like CBS Evening News. But Charles, first of all, he had a passion for photography. He himself was not an accomplished photographer, but he appreciated images and their power, and really knew how to make them work in the story context. Now, in many instances, when I was out shooting with Charles, and we went out with very little lighting equipment. It's not like now where I get a 40-foot truck full of stuff. It was quite different. And invariably, we'd be shooting a crowd scene, and maybe a political candidate is holding forth, doing Q&A. And this area looks great. But then, of course, back there in the corner is where the best questions come from. So unlit and unprepared, I would go back handheld with the Eclair NPR and, get an image through sheer endurance, really, because sometimes we would shoot for 10 minutes, 12, 15 minutes with someone, and nothing was coming out of their mouth worth listening to. But then, unexpectedly, and much to our delight, they would come out with a gem, and then another gem. There was no way to predict it. And this was the unlit part of the room, and you'd be like, that camera weighed probably 15, 20 pounds, and it was just a grueling experience. But that taught me a lot about, in my later work in narrative films, which is, if you don't know a thing about how real people behave, I should think it would be kind of a weird challenge to try to emulate real behavior, or for that matter, if you never had to push the envelope in terms of photography, then who's to say that you're going to understand what real life and light are all about? It was like a school. I mean, I feel like I owe Charles a lot. He himself was dyslexic, and he wrote all of his narration scripts on an 8.5 by 11 legal pad with his left hand, and this sort of strange upside down calligraphy that he had. And he would write typically for a half-hour film. I mean, the one that I know about best is the one that I edited for him for the government of Israel. And he would have an 8.5 by 11 pad. The film would be all cut. We would have already made the pictorial decisions because that was story to Charles. Then maybe a day or two before we'd take it up to New York to mix the sound and do all the final touches, he would sit down at a big 6-plate Steenbeck editing table and stop and start the movie. And on the legal pad, in his own form of handwriting, he would write the words. At the end of the writing session, and he would usually sit down and do it all in one event, there would be maybe 11 pages on the pad. Perhaps 30% of what had been written had been scratched out. But other than that, there it is. Have somebody type it, and let's go to New York. And the words were elegant. Charles wrote with the same kind of spare power, the value of few words saying a lot, as he was often with his pictorial style. And in fact, they were one thing.
Interesting. So very meticulous in his approach. He would demand a lot of you. So now we're going to kind of like jump into now Hollywood during kind of the 70s. What was that like?
Hollywood in the 70s, and for me, the 70s in Hollywood began summer of 1973. There were two things immediately for me. One was starting up a production company with an Air Force friend, starting up a production company that was statistically pretty much doomed. I mean, Mike was from Kansas, I was from Iowa, two guys from the Midwest without connections.
Yeah.
Were really ill-advised to make such a move. But you know what? Fortunately, young people don't calculate the odds, and their burgeoning, their limitless self-confidence, even if they do calculate, they're soon swept away because, of course, they're going to do it. That was what we thought. We did, actually. We really defied the odds by all statistical evidence. We had maybe a 3% chance of survival, but we didn't know that. And in fact, we lucked out and got some good clients for our little company, made supermarket commercials. I did a couple of films for the U.S. Information Agency. And it was, and parallel to that, I mean, we were in business for about 5 years. So in the last half of that run, Mike, who's a fantastic writer, Mike Robe, and you can check out his credits. They're very lengthy and very substantial, primarily in television movies, miniseries, and so forth. He sold his first screenplay. And about that same time, I was able to get into the IATSE Camera Union, which was then Local 659. And so we were just about to buy a building just up the hill from the Burbank Studios.
Really?
And on Barham Boulevard. And I remember because we by that time we had a small staff working for us and a sales rep and so forth. And I remember one blistering hot valley day in July. We were out giving the property one last look through, and we had the papers. We took the papers outside for a breath of air, and we're getting ready to sign the sales agreement and hand it over to the realtor. And we kind of looked at it, looked at each other, and said, "Why are we doing this?" Because had we bought that building, it would have pretty much meant that to avoid a total financial debacle, we would have to continue the company in its present form. And that was the exact moment where we knew we had to go a different way. And we said, okay. And we started to draw down the company almost immediately.
So that moment, looking at, we're going to buy this building, that was a big turning point for you. It was like, we don't want to go any further with this. He's going to go more into the screenplay route. You're going to go into cinematography. I assume that's kind of how it.
Exactly. Now, let it be known that Mike has done a lot of writing/directing. But yes, and at that point, photography was very much in my sights. Although as a documentarian, you often, the cinematographer is the director and is the editor. You're really a kind of a one-stop shop. And long toward the end of the 70s, I won a couple of Cine Golden Eagles for my films, and that was no trifling matter. But I had my heart set on, you talk about almost buying the building across or up the hill from the Burbank Studios. And, we could see those sound stages from the parking lot. It just was too immediate. It was too much there to ignore that that's really what we want to be doing.
It's interesting though, that moment, like kind of that was like, So tell me, how did you hook up with Vittorio Storaro? How did that happen?
Okay, well, it happened in the following way. Part of it can be traced through my wife, Paula, who went to AFI as a producing fellow in roughly that same time, the late 70s. And she had a very dear friend, Peggy King, who was married to Ron Garcia, a wonderful cameraman. Through that relationship, I met Ron Garcia. Now flash forward to Francis Coppola coming to town to set up what would become Zoetrope Studios. He was coming off of great critical success, The Godfather, and Apocalypse Now, which were, those films were earth-shaking for me. Because I so appreciated the artistry and the bold storytelling and the beautiful photography. So it was through this connection, if you will, the friendship, that Ron got me an interview with Vittorio when he came out to shoot, for Francis. And he arranged an interview, and I wound up shooting one of the two camera operators on One from the Heart. I tell you, that project was so terribly important to all of us who worked on it. But it's hard to explain the mood of the Zoetrope lot at that time. I remember the first day of shooting, there was what in those days was a telegram taped to the door of the first soundstage we would work on. And it was from George Lucas to Francis. Hey, brother, break a leg, and it was like, this was everybody, go Francis. And he, of course, he's a wonderful man and a brave artist. His concept was, I'm going to make movies a different way. I'm going to take advantage of the new technical means that we have at our disposal, and I'm going to spend 3 weeks rehearsing this film. We're going to shoot everything on video, very carefully, shot by shot, not running around cinema verite. I'm going to shut down for 2 weeks. I'm going to cut that material. Then we come back for, I think it was 6 weeks, and shoot it exactly as we had rehearsed it. So what a phenomenal opportunity for everyone. The actors, the dancers, us, those of us who are involved on the photographic side, because it was unlike any other film that any of us had worked on before. And that's pretty much how it unfolded. By this time, Francis had occupied virtually every soundstage on his newly acquired movie lot for his own film. And in fact, since none of them was big enough to build an entire Vegas street, a downtown Vegas street, he knocked down a wall between stage 7 and stage 8. So now 2 sound stages became one vast sound stage that was big enough to build. Have you ever seen One from the Heart?
I haven't, but I need to watch it. I
hope you do. Yeah, just know that it was movie magic. Nothing was shot off of that lot. Everything was movie magic. So I hope you will, because it speaks so powerfully to the bold risk-taking that Francis was doing. And my God, Gene Kelly, the legendary dancer, was the choreographer, not in charge, but he was the supervising choreographer. Kenny Ortega was in the trenches, but out of it, ironically, came a product that was just so disliked. I mean, it bombed, totally bombed. Mm-hmm. Now, part of this may have come from the fact that it's a simple love story, so extravagantly told and beautifully told. But at the end of the day, what's it all about? I think that's why another reason I'd like you to see it, because critically, if you just need to respond and you can answer that question for yourself.
Just from looking at I just, glanced at the trailer a little bit. Yeah. Just from seeing it, I think one of the things that probably scared people is, it's a simple love story, but when you bring in that simple love story audience to it, they might be, because Francis does things in a different way. You look at Apocalypse Now. I think it might have overwhelmed them. I have to see the full film to give you my full my full critique on it, but I definitely will now.
I know. Let me just, I don't want to belabor it, but I think you're right. Although the downfall of that motion picture was not, it wasn't on enough screens so that any of the ordinary moviegoers would have seen it. It died 1,000 deaths from critics, media, and because Francis had made so much of it. He went to a little up the river. He did a Kurtz, almost on his own. But I would love to hear what you think of the whole thing.
I mean, as you look at, kind of was destroyed by the critics, but it was more destroyed in editing, is Once Upon a Time in America. If you look at, what was released in America, and then you see what was released, what they premiered at Cannes, and then what they eventually made, they've over the years, restored it. But that's another film that kind of just got lost in the shuffle. And in that 70s kind of 80s time frame, they kind of started to, the 70s was very much a time for filmmakers to be bold. You get into the 80s, it starts becoming kind of where we are now, which is the studio system, more of them taking control and being like, this is what we want. And filmmakers kind of having to deal with that. So I can kind of understand what it. One question I had, and I wrote this down, was Raul Julia. Was he as much of a ball of energy as he is in?
Yes,
I thought so.
And that's a good way to describe him. He was energetic. He was joyous in his work. He was a very upbeat, positive guy.
Yeah,
he energized everything around him.
I can see that. He just has that. It's almost like he's doing stage, but on camera. He's just got that stage presence. But then he's like, okay, now we're going to take the camera and put it to it. And he was able to tone it down just enough for it to be there. But it's like he's almost, it's like Laurence Olivier, where if you look at his early work, he's basically doing stage in his Hamlet and his Richard III, which is why some people don't really like, he's too stagey or whatever. But I feel like, Raul hit that that right, in the middle kind of vibe there. So with Vittorio, what was some of the things that he taught you?
So many things that it's hard to specify, but I think one important underlying concept is love of the art, love of the image, and to not be distracted by the mechanics, or not to let nothing distract you, but to make strong imagery. Now sounds like it's somehow inconsistent with great filmmaking, but you can look at his entire filmography. You will see very almost operatic filmmaking. He had no problem changing the color of the light in the middle of the scene. He had no particular concern about moving light and having it a painterly element that was if he wanted, could be changed in the middle of the scene, and often did. I have so much respect for Vittorio, and I think that I guess underlying everything that I learned from him, it was don't do any shortcuts to making it good and making it genuine. Don't just run in and knock off a close-up in the lingo of, oh, okay, we're going to run and get a pop of this or a pop of that. It's a shot. And the shot is in the language of the movie. There's no such thing as just knocking it off.
Do you think that's the danger we're in right now? Is we have all the technology to basically do absolutely anything. But the thing that seems to be, I think, pressuring a lot of filmmakers is the time element. And now we have almost the time because we don't have the problem of, shooting with film where, you only had this much. You can just shoot as long as you want, but we're still like kind of, I imagine that's like the dilemma, the time, and then we want to do it well. How do you combine those two?
Well, it can be done, not only in theatrical films, but there's some wonderful television, episodic, and the rest that is extremely artful within the confines of their setting, their story, their hospital, whatever. Yeah. So I don't think the two are mutually exclusive. Now, there were aspects to shooting One from the Heart that were very self-indulgent, no doubt. I mentioned earlier this pre-rehearsal stage that we had. Well, but was it indulgence or was it a process that would deliver everyone to a better understanding what we were doing? For me, and like I say, Enrico Umatelli and I, would work, kind of split the workload of the camera operator. There was one shot that's in the film, one scene, I should say, that was shot entirely in one take. There were 20 or 30 different individual camera moves. It's the scene. You'll notice it when you. It's the guys are sitting on their side of the wall in their apartment, and Harry Dean Stanton and Fred Forrest, and then this. And the camera's getting lots of angles, always fluidly moving, and not on a Steadicam, mind you. This is like on a heavy, big dolly.
Yeah.
And then the wall behind them, light goes down and the light comes up on the other side. It's a theatrical scrim. Now we see the girlfriend aspect next door with Terry Garr. And now the camera I was operating dollies down a long hallway into that apartment, and we finish out the scene. So we rehearsed it for a day during the rehearsal period. We returned and shot it for a day. And I've got a picture of myself in the camera department standing next to, I'm not that tall, but nevertheless, I was standing to a stack of 1,000-foot film cans, was almost at eye level. But at the end of that indulgence, if you will, we had 7+ minutes of the movie finished. The old saying, method to the madness. I think there was a significant amount of logic to what Francis was doing. And I think it led us to a unique outcome, even though a very unpopular movie.
I don't know. I'm gonna have to watch it and see what it is, and then I'm gonna have to find out what. But yeah, in those days, if a critic or word of mouth destroyed a film, it wasn't like today where you would have like a subset of people that would come, because there wasn't really video. there wasn't that video. Once a movie bombed, it was just kind of like it just went away. Now with video, you know, if a movie doesn't do well, it has a chance to kind of come back up, or at least make its money back in the home video. Although that's kind of going away now. Now we have streaming.
Well, but regardless of the technology, it can find an audience that would
Yeah.
have been fairly well, yeah. If the theaters were and the critics were, if the critics essentially would could crush distribution, because every time an exhibitor signs on to put a print in a theater, they have to depend on its drawing power, right, and its popularity.
Yeah.
And if it's already been condemned in the press, that's not a very desirable possibility.
And look, when I just looked it up, it came out in 1981. What comes out after that, 1982, you get Blade Runner, which is a fantastic film, which completely bombed. So it's weird when you start to get into that 80s, the films that started to take chances started to get like really hurt, because Star Wars comes out in 77, as well as, you know, Rocky, and it starts to kind of set this tone for what people are starting to see film to be. You get Alien as well, and then so I can imagine probably Francis Ford Coppola, a Kubrick, these characters kind of having a hard time, because the studios they're seeing these films like Blade Runner that are taking these giant chances. I believe that's the same year as Once Upon a Time in America.
Mm-hmm.
So not a good time to, you know, to be a filmmaker that's coming in with the. One thing I wanted to ask you about Apocalypse Now, because you said that really hit you. What was it about that film that what was it about Apocalypse Now? I mean, I have my reasons for it. I was fortunate to see it for the first time at an IMAX planetarium, where like the whole screen was there and like really absorb it. Because it was a film I always wanted to see, but I was like, I don't want to see it in my living room. I need to see this on the big screen. So I waited, and like in 2019, there was a theater that was showing it at like a planetarium IMAX. I'm like, okay, this is where I need to see it, so that I can, you know, feel the colors and see everything. But yeah, what was it about Apocalypse Now?
Well, when I saw Apocalypse, it had not been that long since I was actually in Southeast Asia, and the world that Francis created was very operatic and very much larger than life, but not that much larger than life. Would there have been a Colonel Kurtz? I mean, I met people who were not so poetically unhinged, you know, and I didn't meet them in a dark cave-like structure with a, you know, guy playing with his forehead, you know. What a brilliant image, right? Were there guys like, forget the character's name, but the swashbuckling cavalry officer down with his saber leading the charge on the beach? That's a bit over the top, but they symbolized people that I knew or I observed. So to me, Apocalypse was full of truth. It rang true for me as a veteran who had spent some time over there.
I mean, even that opening shot where, you know, seeing his mind is a jungle, and we're going into his mind through seeing his images, and we're kind of coming out of it. I just thought that, and you have The Doors, The End, which actually made them a more popular band, that song being in that film. I mean, such a blend of all these things. Did you get to talk to him about making that film?
No, I didn't, although I did have, you know, some opportunities to chat with Francis, more geared toward what we were doing at the time. I remember one snippet of conversation we had that was interesting and predicted the future of our the way we make films. I was Francis spent a lot of time out in an Airstream trailer with an offline editing system, sauna, I mean, and a jacuzzi and an espresso machine. And that was his. And there was a big speaker on set at all times. And if he wanted to comment on anything, if it was something that was appropriate for the entire crew to hear, he'd have no compunction about, oh, okay, say, can you come over here go to the telephone, and then he'd have a word with the actor. Well, anyway, he would venture forth. He would come to the stage. Obviously, he didn't abandon that process. But I remember we were watching a playback on a monitor on one occasion, and when the playback was finished, he turned to me and he said, Tom, there's going to come a day not too far from now when we'll do this a lot more. In fact, we may not even have an actor. And I'm like, he was, of course, this is really far out, Francis. What digital people, that was a bit hard to grasp. He, however, had boundless confidence in filmmaking evolving in a way that made it possible to tell stories more effectively. He's no pie in the sky guy. He's a realist, and he's been in the trenches enough times to know that there's no technology, there's no gadgetry that can solve a filmmaker's challenge, really. Excuse me.
I mean, yeah, he is kind of predicting the truth of what has happened to film in some ways. I mean, we're now seeing more and more films not film in location. If you don't notice those things, that's fine. But like, I don't know, Jungle Cruise or whatever, they filmed it in front of green screen, and it's like it's not the same. You can't feel the weather. It just looks superimposed on it.
Well, and of course, yes, it often has that feeling. It's very challenging. Green screen, blue screen, rear projection, because the technology is quite easy, actually, now. I remember when it was quite a big deal to shoot blue screen. And you now, to simply put a character in front of a green or blue screen and make the matte and replace that green or blue screen with a different background, that's easy. It doesn't require any, if you expose it a certain way. The VFX guys, the visual effects people, have no trouble compositing the two very, very nicely. But the challenge is, how does that foreground interact with the background and vice versa? Because any shot of any ambition whatsoever, there's a lot of visual nuances and some not nuances, some obvious features that if they're not done properly, then it starts to look fake because it is fake. So the challenge is in the nuance. The challenge is joining and making it credible that foreground is at one with the background.
Okay, that about does it for this episode. I want to thank my guest, Thomas Ackerman. As always, you could find me at Justin Yachts. Please like, share, and subscribe. And check out the YouTube version. And stay tuned for part 2 of my interview with Thomas Ackerman. And I will see you next time on the DMF.